Now, the mirror neural network, of course, has to connect to the default mode, which is your mentalizing network. And there is different connections that have been described. And it's interesting that in children, this still has to develop and takes time for the connections to develop, especially between the insula and the posterior cingulate. Now, if you have empathy, that is a combination of your mirror neural network and your mentalizing network. But interestingly, you do not have activation of your anterior default mode network, which makes sense because if you, in order to feel empathy, you have to kind of shut down your own self-representational state so you can really try and feel what the other person feels without being interfered with your own self-representation. And this is what goes wrong in autism. So in autism, it has often been described that autism is related to hypomirroring, that it's a deficiency of the mirror neuron system. However, if you look at this meta-analysis of 187 studies on autism, the mirror neuron network does not seem to be involved whatsoever, but there seem to be differences in the lateral default mode network, so in the social mentalizing network rather than in the mirror neuron network, as well as in the connection between the lateral and posterior cingulate. But interestingly, from connectivity point of view, they are underconnected between the mentalizing network and the superior temporal sulcus, but overconnected between the medial prefrontal cortex, so which suggests that somebody with autism actually cannot shut down the self-representational network and therefore has problems really feeling what the other person is interpreting, mentalizing what the other person is really doing. So there's quite a lot of pathologies related to the default mode network, such as Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, Parkinson, epilepsy, depression, ADHD, and autism. I will give an example of that, but first maybe Jay can talk about EEG and the default mode network.
Just beforehand, is the default mode network that occurs during a resting state and all the others are triggered?
It used to be said that the default mode network was task negative, so that it was active when you were not performing a task, yep. But actually that's incorrect. So when you pay attention to something, your default mode can become less active, but it will still be active, because if it's completely shut down, there's no reference from an external stimulus to yourself, and then the stimulus doesn't make sense, right. Because the stimulus has to be related to yourself. Yeah. But it is more active than when you mind wander, when you're internally, when you're paying attention to yourself. It does not shut down completely. It cannot shut down completely, because if it shuts down completely, there is no mental self anymore.
Yep. One last question. You were saying on the previous slide about the speed, that in autism that some of the networks are slower
or less connected and over-connected. So it's both it's a connectivity that there is there's some parts that are also differentially activated, especially the lateral part, so the kind of the social part of the default mode network. But based on connectivity, it's also a problem of not being able to shut down the connection from your self-representation towards the mentalizing network. So it's not a lack of, it's not that they cannot mirror, because the mirroring network seems to be normal. It's just the interpretation is difficult because they cannot shut down their own self, and therefore they cannot really feel empathy because their self is still in the way.
And to measure that, are you measuring how one activates after another?
No, these meta-analyses are just co-activation studies. So they look what is activated. These connectivity studies, you can look at connectivity in different ways, but usually it's just looking at synchronized activity.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
If you look at one after the other, then you're talking about effective connectivity, directional connectivity.
Derek, would the over-activation of the self-referential system also be involved in something like OCD?
We'll talk about that later. Schizophrenia is very complex because there you have hub pathologies, so that you've got overactivity in certain parts and you've got connectivity problems. So it's a combination of a connectivity disorder and a activity disorder. So it's not just, you've got pure activity disorders and you've got pure connectivity disorders, but schizophrenia is a combination of both, which makes it more difficult.
Are there any implications for treatment in autism from diagnosis?
I've never treated any autistic patients except for their anxiety, which is often associated. But the autism itself, whether you can treat that from a purely theoretical perspective, you would try to connect to suppress the hyperconnectivity that goes from the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So you'd have to do an infra-slow, because it's more than one network, default mode network training from a purely theoretical perspective.
And working the coherences apart rather than.
Yes, you don't want to even increase the already increased coherence from the anterior part of the default mode network. You want to downtrain that.
So, you basically learn how to speak by mirroring or mimicking ma, 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 pa, 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 da, da, da. Pretty soon, mama and papa are different beings. And first you mimic, that's the frontocentral aspect of the mirror neuron loop, but then once you start to comprehend, that's the centrotemporal portion of that loop. So you mimic and then lay down comprehension. Temporal lobe on the left side, the Wernicke area generally, ends up being where that comprehension ends up tapping in. On the right side, you lay down comprehension of affect. Facial expressions, the mother smiles when the baby smiles, they grimace, you mimic facial expressions, and when you comprehend that, the facial recognition area on the right side, which is the equivalent of Wernicke. If he had a sister, she might have studied the right hemisphere, who knows, but no one stuck their name on it, luckily. But it's the equivalent on the right side where you comprehend affect. So this is essentially related to the EEG with respect to mu. If your mirror neuron system is not engaged with the outside world, you see mu. If you close your eyes, you have alpha at 0102. If you're disconnected from the outside world, you see mu at C3, C4. It's the same basic thing. It's an idling rhythm of that network. So mu can be treated. A little bit of a question on how you work with the autism population. And you can, in fact, if you see mu, you know the frontal lobe is not engaged. If you fix the frontal lobe, the mu will go away, but you can also directly suppress mu. Both of those approaches are done in the neurofeedback world. I prefer to make sure that the frontal lobe is working, not just to directly suppress the mu, but there are other folks that just do the direct mu suppression. So you can actually engage the mirror neuron system. You can also treat with medication. Oxytocin decreases mu. Oxytocin is a social binding hormone, and it enhances your contact with the outside world. So mu is decreased with oxytocin. And so the discussion a little bit about the clinical aspects of the mirroring issue. And then obviously in autism, the mu is present in about 70% of the autism. Now, if you ask a neurologist, is mu abnormal? They'll say, oh, hell no. It's a normal EEG rhythm. And for neurology, that's absolutely correct. There's no pathology, no tumor, no stroke, no AV malformation, no odd cortical dysplasia. There's nothing wrong with the brain. It's a functional pattern. It's not pathology. But it loads very heavily into pathology. In the normal population screened for neurology but not ADD, you find about 20% of the normal population has mu. But ADD, about 50%. Affective disorders, about 50%. Autism, about 70%. So if it's so normal, what's it doing in all these pathologies? Well, again, it's a dysfunction. It's not a pathology, it's a dysfunction. It's a big difference. You don't have to go in after it. You basically can teach how to get rid of it, which is a very good thing. We basically end up having also the default mode network, which was identified in the fMRI, which takes time to create the image. The difficulty with it is that that time smears the EEG. So when we see the posterior cingulate, the anterior aspect, and the two temporal lobe aspects as though it's a stable network, that's an illusion created by smearing time for a second or a second and a half that it takes to acquire that fMRI image. If you then don't look at the fMRI, but you actually look at the EEG, you can actually break down the EEG in what's called microstate analysis, which may be a little bit of an odd concept if you're not familiar with it. So let's unwrap that a little bit. The default mode network, the microstate analysis was originally developed by Dietrich Lehmann, which he's passed. At the time, he was Roberto Pascal Marquis' boss at the Key Institute for Mind-Brain Studies in Zurich, the people who wrote and owned the code for Loretta. And what they've done is they've looked millisecond by millisecond by millisecond at the EEG, which seems kind of tedious if you've been used to flipping 20 seconds at a time across for paper. Looking at a millisecond at a time seems almost, foolish. But when you actually do this, you find that the brain holds a semi-stable state for about 84 milliseconds, plus or minus a couple of milliseconds. And at that point, that pattern dissolves and another pattern forms. These are microstates, and when you blend them together, you create the default mode state. So what we basically end up having is 4 separate pieces. The posterior cingulate by itself is one of those states. So posterior cingulate all by itself is here. The posterior portion by itself is sitting there as one piece of this network. It's also got to the temporal lobe on the left, the temporal lobe on the right, and from the posterior to the anterior. Now, this sits by itself. This is a unidirectional piece. This is bidirectional, and this is bidirectional. And they don't just have alpha. Everybody thinks of the default mode state as alpha, but there's beta in these networks as well. So not just resting state alpha, this actually has beta in it as well. So a bidirectional segment, these are posterior to the left, posterior to the right. Those are 2 separate pieces, posterior to anterior, unidirectional, and then sitting by itself. Now, if you page down on this, you'll end up seeing the fMRI image and the pieces of it. Basically, the fMRI image, if you look at it carefully, you'll see a large flare at the posterior hub, which is there in all 4 pieces. So it's big. It's there 4 times. The left side only once, the right side only once, and the frontal only once. So you see small flares at the sides and the front, and a big flare at the posterior area because of the timing. One of them's there 4 times, and it loads very largely, and the others are only there 1/4 of the time, so they're smaller pieces of this network. So basically, you've got, this is the fMRI image, and that's large because it's there 4 times. Every single time that posterior cingulate is lit up. But the left side and right side and frontal are only there 1/4 of the time. That's why they're smaller flares. So if you look at fMRI definitions of networks, which is how networks have been identified, you can't believe it until you look at it with the EEG and actually tease apart whether the network is a stable network. You could model the default mode network as though it were stable, and you would fail because it's not. You have to look at it as a dynamic network. If you model it as though it's stable and has coherence that's stable, you'll fail. Actually, somebody tried to use the default mode network in treating addiction because alpha training and alpha theta training in addiction seems to work, so they tried this. It was a gross failure. They actually had really bad outcomes with the addiction population they were working with, including suicidality and recurrence of the addiction. So this is not a good outcome. Using alpha and alpha theta, people have much better outcomes than that. So it's not that neurofeedback doesn't work with addiction. That approach, assuming that network is stable, is what failed. Before you believe a network is translatable from fMRI to EEG, tease it apart with microstate analysis to see what the dynamics within the network actually are, because these networks that are identified with fMRI are not stable. They flip-flop right in front of you if you look with faster technology than fMRI. EEG is millisecond time domain, fMRI is not. They get great work when you do them together, but either of them separate, you miss a lot of things. So it's wonderful to integrate the technologies, and actually doing EEG in the fMRI machine is something that can be done. It's technologically a little fastidious, but it's actually the right thing to do. Basically, Dirk had mentioned that the autism population, it's not just the mirror neuron issue. There's a competing network, basically. And the brain is full of networks and anti-networks. And think about it. If you're trying to be sensitive to the outside world, to listen to the outside world, perceiving the outside world, not just with your ears, but to perceive it, very much like trying to listen carefully. You can't speak and listen at the same time. If you don't believe that, find somebody face-to-face with them. Both of you try and come up with something you really want to communicate, and then both start at the same time. You know, it's a terribly inefficient way to behave, to speak and listen at the same time. It just does not work. So anyway, as such, the speak and listen at the same time gives you a good analogy of the networks and anti-networks. You can't engage a network and the anti-network at the same time and still function. Basically, the paper is in your handout. I could have shown you only the slides, but you would miss all the detail. Kind of looking at an fMRI versus the EEG, I'd rather deliver the detail. So in the handout, you'll actually get the entire paper. It's the primary author is Roberto Pascal Marquis, the author of Loretta, actually he goes way back in time with E. Roy John. For those of you who don't know much about E. Roy John, Roy John was considered the grandfather of Cuban neuroscience. And you might think, well, he's an American. How the hell did he get hooked up with those Cubans? Well, Roy John was on the blacklist during the McCarthy era. He's a communist, and he is a proud communist, but he was blacklisted. And the Cubans loved him because he was communist and Cuba was communist. So he would take a boat ride across to Cuba and spent quite a bit of time there. And he established the Cuban Neuroscience group. Castro's nephew had some neurological stuff, so they could fund whatever they want to when you're a dictator. So they funded this neurological institute. And Roy John, working with Roberto Pascal Marquis in Cuba, and the Montreal Neurological group, basically pieced detail of that was basically Montreal Neurological took MRI images, and voxel by voxel by voxel, they defined whether it was gray matter, white matter, cerebrospinal fluid, skull, what is it? And they then limited the solutions to gray matter because you can see EEG from gray matter. You don't see white matter. You don't see cerebrospinal fluid generating rhythms. So they restricted the source analysis to the gray matter. And Roberto had the insight to basically say, well, EEG with linked ear montages is really not that reliable. You have to get away from that to a Laplacian montage. Step one in Loretta is to transform to a current source density, radial current source density. And when it synchronized radial current sources, he projected it deep in that area. So he's looking for current source density and synchrony, and he'll provide that within his, thank you, provide that within the code. So it was a brilliant step. Most of the inverse solutions at the time were very shallow. They didn't show depth. And his was really the first one to show logically normal sources for voltage. Now, Loretta will never show the source of alpha in the thalamus, which is what's generating the frequency. It'll only show you the voltage source. So it's not really the source of the rhythm, it's the source of the voltage associated with that rhythm. And you have to remember that because you'll never really see a lot of the rhythm generators. You will not see deep brain structures like the caudate, and they're monopoles. You will not see them in EEG land. So you have to be aware of the limitations. Anyway, I believe we're probably ready for some real science. I'll hand this back over to Dirk.